current fantasy, the topic of modernity, innovation and abstraction, particularly landscape painting at the end of Joseon Dynasty, 18th-19th century, landscape and tradition. Is the landscape painting in Korea related to the most classical because of tradition inherited from China? It has been treated as some painting been called minhwa, a manner original and new, and it is shown in the view of Kyungpode, the one collection. Here, emptiness is the center of the painting and the point of the lake. In fact, the context has changed in the 19th century since the time period, or the period of Song, and a painter like Kim Soo-chul has been perceived by some scholars as sensible to influence coming from the West, even if it still matter of discussion. Landscape in Korea has anyway followed sometimes its own way, as suggested a literary history from the beginning of the Joseon period, 15th, 16th century, which play with ellipse, perspective, or depth in the stage of landscape, which surmounts the list of the participants. Its Koreanization appears even more marked in the 18th century with a painter like Johnson and later Simon-do, who developed the landscape described from the nature while adopting at the same time a global vision and a perspective deliberately affirmed. Following that could be mentioned the screens and the topic of the Diamond Mountains and Gongsan, which are in the direct line of a painter like Johnson. We mentioned also the painting with turquoise in front of a background of Atlantic mountains with apocalyptic forms from the European collection, a landscape which plays with fantastic design, sharp lines, a perspective that is surrealistic between dream and nightmare. There is a pendant to this painting, a painting with a fish jumping out of the water in front of a background of fantastic clouds, dynamic and moving, a fish of which the size fills all the composition, and which seems to be a mirage or maybe an hallucination. But this approach may be marked in part by the European influence through the link of Peking, changed at the end of Joseon Korea. From an unique point of view, an accent put on the depth that occasionally could take an aspect almost fantastic, painting to become later simple composition which play very fun with flatness, with line and with decor. Nevertheless, in the first stage, this graphic approach could take sometimes an aspect close to surrealism when a bunch of flowers appears in the mountain, bigger than them. A bunch of flowers dominates the mountain by the brightness of its color, but also by its size. The size very often is rare. This approach could also put the accent on the line. It could even sometimes tend to Japan in the way of drawing, with its taste at the curve of circumvolution, and then in that case placed in 2 dimensions. So the realistic process, when it is adopted, plays the part of green, but later it vanishes and becomes more and more flat, with the line and decor treated in a linear way. Expressionism and landscape, color, perspective and movement. But concurrently, expression is becoming more free, direct and spontaneous, almost more personal, an expression far beyond the classical codes usually used, creating a true alchemy of color with a very specific poetry. Rocketed to the last manner of Johnson, who prevented the succession of touch to create the relief, this one vanishing in space on a white paper sheet, the landscape evolved to a composition more and more simplified with the real strands. And some painting considered as minhwa, the realism is used through perspective and depth, but at the same time denied. The painter privileging the range of colors, or more exactly the juxtaposition of colors, more often very violent, willingly contrasting in order to paint the relief, adopting a process deliberately pictorial, where the line traces the shape of the mountain. The artist, while figuring the hills typically Korean, plays the chromatic, the flatness, the movement on the stroke, and the vertical scale, without worrying about the visual reality, but at the same time suggesting it by its global vision on a almost geometric. This way, the landscape is at the same time realistic but also conceptual. It appears as a reality reviewed and corrected by the painter vision, mixing sometimes the Western types of perspective, which play with depth, in the manner of Johnson, and the one specific to Asia, conceived as a bird aid, and it is shown with a representation of pavilions lost in the countryside. The alliance between the pure color useful hills with their round shape, painted sometimes in blue, in black, or in red, the wash drawing which play with ochre, green, or white, and the line very precise to delineate the silhouettes of the trees, the shapes of the figures, create a magic very specific when the tradition seems to be revisited. As I've noticed, Gauguin, color which is vibration as music, is capable to get to what is the most general, and nevertheless, at the same time, the more vague in nature is interior strength. Here, the violence of the brush suggests the light force, the strength of the nature, and the human figures are only represented by schematic volumes with a lot of humor. On one side, the image records the first landscape from the 3 Kingdom period, which are painted tombs of the Curio. On the other side, it adopts a very modern process when it is a colors, which structure all the space with the volume reduced to essential and only to the forms. All that with a sense of movement very well suggested by the stroke of the brush. Output on landscape. This approach is sometimes done of a very naive mode, when a complete screen described with amusement sends from the countryside, in a manner which announced, in a way, the naive school of painting in ex-Yugoslavia in the 1970s. In the West, what has been called art has been recognized since the 1920s. But already here, reliefs, animals, personages are sketched in a very simplified manner, painted on a background completely empty and white, where the elements of the composition float in a total liberty, following the fantasy of the painter and the space still available on the screen. In one case, the artist plays expressionism of color, illusion of movement, vanishing point to a far horizon with earth or distended lines, songs to his own will, announcing the Fauvisme, 1905. In another, the approach seems to be almost childish, but plays here too with a decorative aspect. That means with the colors, the deliberate simplification of the form, the flatness. The elements supposed to figure the countryside being displayed in a very concentric way, but at the same time in a way that seems totally at random on the background of white paper. Each scene may justify by a description in Chinese character. From the realistic approach, the evolution of the landscape painting is going to a really more and more abstract, purely intellectual, where the concept predominates on the naturalism. Even if sometimes some humor is added, like with the literally crossing the bridge, as can be seen also the echo of the classical painting, which could be a source of inspiration following the fantasy of artists. The point here is not reality, but the pleasure of painting, the pleasure of forms of color, the pleasure of drawing. The main point is canvas as the base of imagination, freedom, or fantasy. As Liu Fan has said about the painting of Matisse, art of the French artist is definitely not about nature, about object described as a painting, even if he says that. It is just an open window to catch some fresh air. Decorative and landscape, flatness and geometry, predominance of color. This test of flatness for colors for a concept at the border of abstraction can be seen on the screens of the palace, especially the ones installed behind the King's Throne in the room for official audience, at the Kyungbo Palace or the Changnam Palace, even at the Toksu Palace. The topic of sun and moon, dominating a landscape of mountains with sharp rocks, is striking by the simplification of the drawing, the violence of the contrast, the manner to play with the forms, the mass being reduced to the essence of the identity. If the 20 or so examples still preserved actually do not have inscription of date, Professor Isangmi nevertheless distinguished among them 3 types very distinct from the stylistic point of view. From the 17th century to the end of the Joseon period, the evolution going from realism, following the tradition of the blue-green landscape in the manner of the Tang Dynasty, 18th century, to a progressive simplification middle of the 19th century, to give at the end a composition completely abstract, base and volume, of which schematization is pushed to the extreme, with very bright colors, pure colors disposed on a flat way, colors of which origin seems to have been in imported now from the West through the testimony of records on the Royal Archives. Then, the term suggests a chronology which, from its Chinese origin to its progressive Koreanization, more and more strongly affirmed in the 18th and 19th century. It is also the pretext to one of the best paintings of the Joseon collection at the Oam Museum in Yongin, showing the evolution of the stem and its figuration and the almost decorative. This way, it testifies to an authentic vision, typically Korean, where the sense of elevation, the taste for experimentation has never been lost till the end of Joseon Korea. In fact, the term tradition in Asia appears under that form only in the peninsula. This topic of rocks with their fantastic shapes, which play with the movement, the flatness of color, could in a way be combined with some other topics specific to the Arab Kingdom, as the one of the Pyrenees, and give at the end a decorative motif evoking the Nabi 1900 or even Art Nouveau. The same taste for violent colors can be seen in the topic of the 10th symbol of the longevity as it is represented in the version of the 19th century. In fact, the evolution is going in the sense of simplification when it does not privilege background flat and without decor. In that case, the theme of butterfly flying among the rocks with the back of the screen empty, completely void and naked, is maybe one of the most elegant. This topic is seen later in a version with birds and flowers, or in another one with insects, frogs and plants, with still the same background entirely empty, void and naked, but treated this time in a blue color in a very unrealistic way, a definitely decorative approach. But this passage from perspective and depth to painting more and more far from the pure realism and from the true painting in the continuity of painter like Johnson suggests here too an evolution and a chronology from the 18th century to the end of the 19th century. It is at the same time the reflection of aesthetic, of sensibility. It is also typical of the topic of the modernities in the Korean way, typical of the taste for new combination, the sense of composition will still very alive until 1910 and the end of the independence. Testifying of this approach, the same theme of the screens depicting bookshelves leads to the same statement, typically Korean way. In the series of screens depicting books which are called typically, three manners schematically exist. A manner so-called westernized, which appear with a true perspective and illusionist way inspired by Europe. A manner which could be called Chinese, with book and curious, displayed in a space without any decor. The third manner, on the contrary, seems to be more local, more typically Korean, with its accumulation of objects conceived with a geometry very elaborate, a geometry which proceeds by lines, sometimes antagonistic, deliberately divergent, vanishing in the back of the Asian board. Three types. These three types suggest different public, different universities, and a chronology. The illusionist way refers to China of the 18th century and seems to be an echo of the curiosity developed by the Shillak movement. The Chinese type, on the contrary, if it refers also to the Chinese manual, it is to a China maybe more orthodox and sometimes more light, more traditionalist, and in a way more archaic in style, without any curiosity, any spirit of openness to other tradition and to other new world. In the two cases, the screens evoke the palace and the court, but at different times. The illusionist type obviously starts in the 18th century, even if it still exists during the 19th century or at the beginning of the 20th century. In the inverse, the Chinese type recalls the atmosphere of the Dong Arc movement at the end of the 19th century, returned to the value of the East, seen as the essence of the local culture, even in some example apparently seems to have been more ancient. In return, the third type, called Korean, seems to be located in between and refer maybe to a different class, a new one, so-called class of interpreter, Chung-in. Its most beautiful period could have been at the end of the 18th century, even its type still exists in a more naive way during the 19th century. Nevertheless, for memory, a painting from the Yuan collection interior of Kitseng is definitely a painting from the 18th century, and its fluidity recalls in a very striking manner the atmosphere of Japanese screen depicting the same topic and dated of the 17th century. However, beside the first painting of the Liu Huan collection, there is a second panel, which belongs to the same series. This one announced already the so-called Korean type, showing the antiquity of its apparition in the middle of the 18th century, in the direct continuity of the Chongsun portrait. The type very different in its structure position from the two other types, but the theme here is still at its very beginning, far from the exuberance of imagination that will be developed later, at a period very well defined and precisely located in the chronology compared to the end of the evolution of the chicory screen. A poetical approach of the world with a singular construction. As a matter of fact, this type is also innovative. It is as innovative even more than the two other ones, in a way far more original, even more surprising by its freshness, its gaiety, its poetical and well-ordered vision of the world. For each panel, there is one composition conceived as a true painting, and a set of all the panels gives a read on the screen, of which size is more or less high. It is here that very often, for the best, the fantasy and imagination of the local artist appear. A fish in its bowl emerged from between the books and the scrolls, or the bunch of flowers of very bright colors, very clear tonality suggesting a political realism typical of Korea at the end of the Joseon period, a political realism that seems specific to the peninsula. All the objects presented here are very eclectic, usually Korean, but from foreign origin, generally Chinese, sometimes European, as in the case of the two other modes of that type of subject. In that way, it is possible to find among these accumulations a part of screen of which a mounting is clearly visible, but also the topic. Here, the figure could be referring to the theme of immortals or to the Taoist sage. On the left of the screen, the classical topic of the landscape in the Chinese manner, the Chinese ink. The screens are then the testimony of the first rank of the way of life in Joseon Korea. They are also a testimony of its imagery, which curiously seems to privilege the moment or instant, the unbearable lightness of existence, as said Milan Kundera. It's reviewed here with a lot of freshness, of sensibility, almost of insouciance. In some cases, the artist can adopt a global point of view, and a unique composition where the Korean approach is mixed with foreign influence, probably coming from Europe through the link of Peking, the interior of a literary cabinet, stealthily and almost by chance, in a natural way, almost by accident, through a tiger screen open as a stage curtain. This one allowing to see the working office left in a skillful disorder, and if the master of the house has gone out of the room just some minutes ago, one art museum in Yongin. This time combined a remarkable sense of observation with a sense of theater, a sense of production, playing the perspective in a realistic manner, but this time reviewed and corrected from a Korean point of view, and it's clearly shown by a tiger skin, symbol by excellence of the Joseon Kingdom, even if it seems directly inspired by the carpenters and in the King Songjo as Chonghan Gyeonggi Provincial Museum. By its realism, it is far from the geometric composition with books developed later, which play with volumes on colors on a more quasi-abstract and very powerful. From marvelous to fantastic. On the screen, nevertheless, are more enigmatic with the presence of small figures, human silhouette, true goblins, mannequin, or witch nature, as still to be defined, maybe spirits, genius of gods, of which population has inhabited Korean universe in ages, but who are very small in the composition as they are completely dominated by the gigantesque size of the object presented in the painting. This figurine evokes an atmosphere of fairy tale, a poetical atmosphere often expected, at the same time malicious, mysterious, and magic. The question then is to know from where come all the codes, this vocabulary, this richness of invention, and that in a society supposed to be Confucianist, hierarchic, rulingly rigorous. There is no equivalence in the classical painting, neither in Japan or China. And in China, the ambiance there is very different. It could be fantastic, demoniac, or macabre. It could be also frightening, create an universe very dark, plays with legend of an repetitive. But it does not suggest this atmosphere of dream, fluid, and definitely light, but at the same time completely unwedged, even if it's still very classical and privileged the beauty. Sure, In the series where animals appears in front of background with mountains as a background, this one could evoke in a far way the event of the landscape painting of the 18th century, which especially the series of Johnson on the Diamond Mountain. It could recall also some works of Kimonglo, but the composition here is already different. It could even be seen on a mode that is close to the dream, a mode that is almost realistic as the one created later by a painter like Magritte. A world at the border of nightmare, evoking the outbreak of the naive art, which has enjoyed the urban avant-garde after the First World War. This atmosphere is strange, mysterious, far from the human world, like an echo of another planet. The perspectives are twisted, the dimension universe, creating a very strange atmosphere in some of the painting, which could evoke sometimes the universe of Max Ernst, or events of comics of today. Our faculty of representation in the dream, as writer Schopenhauer, is going far beyond our faculty of imagination. Obviously, should be recognized here a manner, a style, even maybe a specific artist. A fact that seems to be suggested by the emergence of universe, often very personal, is the elaboration of theme in the construction of the composition. And that point can be confirmed by the presence sometimes of the same kind of theme, the same composition compared to the Lyon collection in some of the paintings of the Lyon collection kept today at the One Art Museum in Yongin or at the Lyon Museum. Decorative and typically flatness on geometry, prevalence of the colors. If the approach could be marvelous or naturalistic, it could also appear abstract, almost conceptual, playing with decorative and flatness of color, which we find in centering or image in the composition find of which modernity surprised the 19th century. Here too, when the Lyon collection is compared with the Lyon collection, emerge obviously some specific artists, specific by the vision of the world, the coherence of the approach. The anticonformist is the way to play with all the form. The artists play with the animal realism in the figures described, but the images are flat. They only exist by the form, the flatness of color. At the same time, the silhouettes are integrated in a geometrical schema extremely structured, of which the logic cannot be seen clearly with the background of maple tree in wood or in osier. The series of the book here too adopt a combination of contrasted and very cold colors, parallel with scratch the screen in a mechanical way, creating a perspective which run away and giving us depth in a display nevertheless very flat. The animals then appear sometimes behind the frame, evolving in a plan, sometimes on the contrary, completely unwedged in a floating panel of the composition, even sometimes as taken by surprise by a plan which opened behind them and where emerged some books as coming from lower. Even more spectacular painting in a very simplified way, which curiously evokes the most recent research of the Moscow artists like Anthony Tapies or Claude Viala. Flatness of the color, abstraction of the form, repetition of the motif, arrangement following a geometrical manner. The centering here is deliberately conceptual and not preoccupied by the realism or by the likelihood. The accent is put on the decorative, on the flatness, very far from the chicory of the illusionist type, the chicory of the European mode, very far also from the pile of objects dispersed at random on canvas, following the example for China, with the background naked and completely empty. This type of composition is quasi cubist on that before the time, announcing some artists like Henri Matisse or poetry. Like them, on before them, it plays the predominance of color, of bright and flesh color, like some flower composition of miroir, which testify to a vision, and art of life typically Korean, to a belief in life, an art of abstraction, an art of construction which privilege the light and vitality. The composition wrote Matisse is the art of to arrange in a decorative manner different elements of which the painter can dispose in order to express his feeling. But some more important than the subject itself, the point in the mind of Matisse, as for the miroir style, is a combination of form, the combination of colors, the surface of canvas, the regime of blurring. Conclusion. In the series of the landscape painting, the echo from the academy appears very often present, but it is treated sometimes in an unexpected way. A view of the countryside is then described in a naive mode, with a lot of humor and with simplicity, but the manner Fuseli could also appear very modern with an approach which announced for this event expressionism. The liberty of style, of manner, this liberty in the way of thinking assumes very much in a society supposed to be hierarchic, blocked, very Confucianist. It suggests that Korea, in fact, before the modern time, has already integrated the theory of the modernity without anyone doing the conceptual jump as it was done by the avant-garde in Europe at the beginning of the 20th century. Symptomatic of that is a way to represent the peak of the sun on the moon, which lights the world beyond the 5 peaks. Symptomatic also the age view of the cloud of the river, actually in Japan, Kurashiki Museum of Craft. But the topic of the optical shows the current origin. In reality, it suggests that the Confucianism cannot be seen only as a yoke, but that it is also maybe, first of all, a way of looking at the world, of representing it, and that with its own cause with ever move and are never looking. But for a better understanding, to compare the theme of security in English is more due to the European influence actually dated of the 19th century because of Yong Nok, when it has been dated before during a long time from the 18th century, and the version actually kept at the National Palace Museum, dated from the beginning of the 20th century, is instead clear and definitely striking. The evolution proves a true revolution from the depth to the flat and to the flatness, which paradoxically seems to show Korea already controlling all the codes that will be as a contemporary in the West during the 20th century. The life of an educated man today, we write later Mondrian, is leading progressively the natural world to become more and more abstract. It is the same for art. As a pure representation of the human spirit, art will express itself in an aesthetic form more and more pure, that means abstract. In conclusion, urban landscape antiquity, first, an evolution from the 18th to the 19th century, which is from the perspective of flatness, from the realism to the sense of the decorative, to the vocabulary original and new, without any correspondence, like in a way the Korean Puchong, with the same sense of abstraction, the same sense of fantasy, the same sense of humor. 3, an aesthetic which seems to possess already the base of modern art, of modernity without a future, and that under Confucianism. In one case, as in another, landscape painting or Chekoli develop a way typically Korean, a way original and new, a way very personal of the freshness of a modernity which could not be seen in a way. This unexpected way seems to be at the antipode of the routine version the centuries have given of the Korean kingdom at the end of the 19th century. The kingdom which till the end followed its own way, a way very different of the one followed by the westernization of the mode of Tokyo, or the slow agony of the mode of Peking. To compare some landscape, even some particularly with painting and surrealistic type by Max Ernst realized during the last war, Korean imagery at the end of the Joseon period is definitely astonishing, especially since it's open already new territories at a time completely unexplored, and that long time before the artists from the West. A world where the knowledge, logical and rational, does not block exploration, the all-power of dream, evocation of an event, frozen mirror which paradoxically announced the 21st century. To conclude, maybe it could be nice in the coming future to be able to precise when it is possible atelier an artist in all that production, while precising too, if possible, the chronological approach, since obviously some characters emerge. And that without forgetting that finally the gap isn't so big between the emergence of the contemporary art in the West, Cubism started in 1908, and the Millwork manner. This one is, in a way, the testimony of modernity in the Korean way, but modernity which could not have any possibility because of the end of Joseon Korea, the end of independence, the Japanese occupation, and the hazard of history. I have two more to summarize. Innovation at the end of Joseon Korea, as far as Mihai is concerned, could be seen regarding the landscape as a passage from the true landscape to fantastic, from fantastic to abstraction, from death to plan, and to flatness, from realist to a decorative approach, where the main interest is now the surface, from combination of color to simplification and use of primary color, direct and bright, with sometimes unexpected contrast. Subject is not anymore the point is definitely the painting, the surface of canvas, the colors and shape. The same could be said about chicory, with the emergence of very specific approach different from the Chinese way, different from the European one, the Korean approach, which play here too, with colors and volume, with geometry, composition and accumulation, with surface of canvas. In that case too, the evolution is from illusionism and sense of the nuance, the delicacy of colors, to a decorative approach, very often straight, a liberty of drawing, and to an impression, original and new, with the use of color, flat and strong, even sometimes violent. After the Chinese tradition from the Tang Dynasty, the impact of European influence, the landscape has changed after the painting of Johnson, in a way, the same way that Johnson himself has changed during his life, from Korean realism to Korean abstraction, as it is shown by the comparison between the masterpiece of the Museum and the sketch of the final period kept at the Korea University Museum. Disintegration, form and schematization. The copy of the nature for itself is progressively forgotten. The question then is, what is the origin of this evolution? What is the origin of that, all that vocabulary, all that thematic, all that imagery and code? The question is, why this richness of invention, of dream and fantasy, and who is behind it? The question is iconography, but also aesthetic point of view of painting. To search the reference of that evolution is not in fact easy. Outside Korea, but where? Inside the peninsula, but why? It is in a way in direct line with the classical tradition of the academy, but also in a way in direct reaction against it. Is it connected with the emergence of local traditions coming from countryside or from the provinces? The question is open. Nevertheless, regarding that, could be recalled also the example of Punchong or the tradition of Johnson, with the same taste for geometry and fantastic for lines and schematization, which clearly belong to the Korean tradition. In reality, the decorative approach in Korea at the end of Joseon is far from a Japanese taste for decoration. It is more conceptual, more abstract, and seems to follow the same evolution than the one in the West at the end of the 19th century, with a passage of painting trying to give the illusion of nature, of depth, of realism, to a painting more preoccupied by the surface of canvas, the pleasure of painting, forgetting all souvenir of 3D or illusionist perspective, to play arrangement of volume and color to a two-dimensional approach, even if sometimes, like in the West in the 1920s, after the abstraction, there could be a return to realism, but a new realism, or more exactly, another realism, like the surrealism, directly connected to dream, to fantasy and poetry. Curiously, the parallel in the démarche is not only in the way of thinking, it is also in the chronology, even if there was no connection between the two eras. Anyway, as a matter of fact, Minhwa style of Joseon Korea is in fact almost contemporary of the emergence of modern art in the West, showing the same kind of preoccupation, the same fascination of art, and for painting, for life, and for design. The country of the people in white is also the land of the color, the land of abstraction.
사회자가 가질 덕목 중에 하나가 뭐냐면 너무 이렇게 감정적으로 치우치면 안 되는데 오늘은 제 감정을 솔직하게 표현하고 싶은데 너무 감동적인 말이었어요. Thank you so much, Mr. Peter.